The corridor of Stirling Tower was silent at that hour, a hushed luxury soaked into the velvet carpet and the soft gold sconces. Midnight had long passed, and most of the city that sprawled beneath the tower had given in to exhaustion. Elena Quinn moved slowly, her sneakers barely making a sound, as she carried herself down the hallway with damp hair clinging to her cheeks. She was only 22, a student trying to keep her world intact, and right now her only thought was to find a towel. Her temporary hotel room had flooded when the bathroom pipe burst. The flustered night clerk apologized endlessly and pressed a keycard into her palm, promising this was a spare, unused room on the upper floor. She did not question him. Her head throbbed from exhaustion, and all she wanted was to wash away the day. She pressed the keycard against the door and stepped inside. The breath caught in her throat. The suite was unlike anything she had ever seen. Marble floors glimmered faintly beneath recessed lights, and windows stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting the sleeping city in endless glass. She whispered to herself that she would only be here a few minutes, just enough to borrow a towel and rinse away the mess of the day. Her shoes left faint prints on the polished stone as she moved toward the bathroom. The bathroom was a world of its own. Steam still clung to the mirror from a recent shower, though she did not notice. She hung the borrowed robe she had been clutching loosely and stepped toward the rain shower. The moment the water hit her skin, a sigh left her lips. Warm streams rushed down her shoulders and spine, carrying away the grime, the fatigue, the loneliness that had settled in her chest all evening. She closed her eyes and let her head tilt back, letting strands of dark hair plaster against her cheeks. Elna was not used to luxury. She was used to cold water that sputtered to pipes that coughed before offering anything steady. Here the water fell like silk steady and indulgent, soaking the thin cotton of her underclothes, before she slid them away and let them fall beside the robe. She thought nothing of it. She believed she was in a forgotten guest room, a temporary refuge. Her silhouette blurred behind the frosted glass lines of her body softened by steam. Adrian Kane opened the door to his penthouse at nearly 1 in the morning. His jacket was slung over his shoulder, his tie half loosened after hours of negotiation overseas. He longed for silence, for solitude, for the familiar emptiness that usually greeted him. Instead, he froze. A faint glow spilled from the bathroom. The sound of water reached him soft, yet insistent. For a moment, he believed fatigue was playing tricks on him. Then he stepped farther in quiet as the city beyond the windows and saw it. Through the veil of steam and glass, a woman stood beneath his shower. Her skin shimmered with droplets, her hair wet, and clinging her head tilted back in surrender to the water. She was young, delicate, entirely unaware that she was trespassing in a room that belonged to him. Adrian felt his chest tighten. Most men would have shouted. Most would have called security. But he stood still, hidden in shadow, watching as if compelled. For years, the penthouse had been his fortress, a sterile monument to power and grief. No one entered uninvited. Yet here was a girl who seemed as though she had stepped out of a dream and into his private silence. She did not know she was being watched, and perhaps that was why the sight was unbearable and magnetic all at once. He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe and let his breath steady. His mind reminded him of all the reasons to stop this. Yet something deeper told him to stay. It was not lust that rooted him there, though desire pressed heavy in his chest. It was the fragility of the moment, the way she curled her fingers against the tiled wall, as though steadying herself against an invisible weight, the way she allowed the water to trace every line of her body, as though hoping it could erase more than dirt. Elena reached for the towel hanging beside the glass and pressed it to her face, eyes still closed, lips parting with a faint laugh of relief. She whispered that this felt unreal, words lost in the hiss of water. Adrian heard them anyway. For years he had drowned in silence, and now a stranger's laugh cut through it. The water slowed as she twisted the knob, her bare shoulders glistening in the dim light. She wrapped the towel around herself, still believing she was alone. Adrian remained motionless, caught between stepping forward and retreating. A girl had wandered into his world by mistake, but in her unguarded presence, he felt more awake than he had in years. The silence between them thickened, though she had yet to notice him. He realized then that this moment, absurd and fragile, was not one he would forget. She had broken into his sanctuary without even knowing it. She had walked straight into the heart of his solitude. And for the first time in years, Adrian Kane did not feel alone. Elena tightened the towel against her chest, droplets sliding down her legs as she padded softly out of the bathroom. Her heart slowed her body, still warm from the water, the scent of cedar and leather lingering in the air. She thought she would step into silence, that the room would be as empty as she had believed when she first entered. But when her eyes lifted, she froze. A man stood in the shadows near the window, tall and broad, shouldered his tie, loosened his gaze, steady on her. The towel nearly slipped from her grip as she gasped, stumbling back a step. Her throat tightened, panic rushing in. This was no empty guest room. She whispered that she was sorry, that she thought the room was vacant. The words tumbled out in fragments, fragile and breathless. Adrian Kane took a slow step forward, his eyes unreadable. He did not shout, did not summon security. His voice was low, almost calm, as he asked her what she thought this place was. Elena stammered, explaining the pipe burst, the apologetic clerk, the keycard she had been given. She clutched the towel like armor, every nerve in her body sparking with shame. She expected anger, but there was none. His expression remained composed, though something flickered behind his gray eyes. He handed her another towel from the chair nearby, his fingers brushing the fabric, but not her skin. The gesture was deliberate, controlled, yet it left her trembling as she reached for it. He told her that she had walked into his penthouse as if it were her own, that most people would not dare. She shook her head quickly, insisting it was all a mistake. He studied her, letting the silence stretch until she wanted to collapse under it. Then, almost too softly, he murmured that mistakes usually ended with apologies and exits. Yet here she was standing, wrapped in his towel, looking at him as if she belonged. Elena's cheeks burned, her pulse thundering in her ears. She said she would leave immediately, that she never meant to intrude. She turned to grab her robe, but his voice stopped her. He said she had stepped into his room uninvited, but for some reason he could not bring himself to send her away just yet. She turned back slowly, uncertain whether to feel fear or something else entirely. His eyes locked onto hers, not cruel, not tender, but consuming. He crossed the space between them with deliberate ease, stopping just close enough for her to feel the heat of his presence. He asked her name. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Finally, she whispered Elena. He repeated it once, as though tasting it, letting the syllables settle into the air. She asked for his name, though she already sensed she knew. He introduced himself simply as Adrian. The name struck her chest like a chord. Adrian Kane. The man whose face had appeared on magazine covers, whose empire dominated headlines, the billionaire who moved markets with a word. And now he was standing before her eyes, fixed on her, as though nothing else existed. She stammered again, saying she would go, that she should never have been here. He tilted his head, voice calm, telling her she had already been here. She had already crossed the line, and somehow that was what unsettled him most. She clutched the towel tighter, her skin still flushed from the shower and his nearness. He leaned a little closer, not touching his breath, brushing the air between them. He said that in all the years he had lived in this fortress of glass and silence, no one had stepped into it. Uninvited, no one had dared to break the rules. She had done it without even knowing, and instead of fury, he felt something he could not name. Elna could not breathe. She whispered that she had not meant to disturb him. His lips curved faintly, a shadow of a smile, and he replied that perhaps she had not disturbed him at all. Perhaps she had done the opposite. The air thickened between them. She searched for words and found none. Finally, she reached for her robe, sliding her arms into it. With clumsy hands, her eyes still locked on his. He watched not with judgment, but with a quiet intensity that made her feel both exposed and seen. He said softly that she had walked into his room as a mistake, but she might be the only mistake he was not eager to correct. Her breath caught, her chest ached. She had no idea why his words struck so deep, why her legs felt weak, why her heart beat as if she had been running. She thought she should flee, but her body betrayed her, rooted in place, staring into the gaze of a man who should have terrified her, yet somehow did not. She whispered again that she would leave. He nodded once, but did not move aside. His voice was lower when he told her she could walk out the door, but if she did, she might never know why. He felt as though she was the very person he had been waiting for without realizing it. Silence pressed heavy in the room, filled only by the sound of her pulse and the faint hum of the city lights beyond the windows. She did not answer, she did not move, and Adrian Kane, for the first time in years, felt the fragile edge of possibility crack open inside him. Elena left the penthouse that night with her robe clutched close, the memory of his gaze clinging to her skin. Long after she returned to the modest room the clerk finally arranged, she lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, unable to silence the replay of his words, the weight of his eyes, the strange mix of fear and heat that churned through her veins. She told herself she would never see him again, that she had stumbled into a place she did not belong, and yet part of her chest ached with something she refused to name. The following days should have returned to routine. She attended her art institute, sketching figures and landscapes with mechanical precision, earning polite nods from professors who liked her discipline but never quite noticed her soul. She worked evenings at a cafe to cover what her scholarship could not, cleaning tables, while listening to laughter she was never part of. She lived in a small rented room with peeling paint, eating noodles for dinner, stretching every coin until it bent. She had grown used to being invisible. Her mother had spent her life in a diner working double shifts after her father walked out before she turned 10. Elena learned early that no one would hand her anything, that survival was about effort, not miracles. She carried heartbreak too. Devin, her first love, had been the boy who promised permanence, but kissed another woman in the back of their shared apartment. That betrayal had shattered her trust, leaving her cautious with her heart, careful with her body, never reckless. The dare that night, the burst pipe, the towel borrowed in desperation, had been the closest she had ever come to losing control. Adrian, meanwhile, returned to his penthouse, with her image imprinted in his mind like a brand. He had spent years existing rather than living, rising before dawn, commanding rooms of executives signing deals worth millions, but finding no reason to smile. His empire had been built on precision and power, yet behind the headlines, he was a man hollowed out by guilt. His fiancée had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. They had argued that morning sharp words about her inability to understand his world. She had left in anger and never returned. From that night, the penthouse bed remained untouched, the shower unused, the silence heavier than stone. He buried himself in work, allowing his board to call him ruthless, his rivals to call him cold. It was easier to be feared than to be seen, until Elena. That night she had walked unknowingly into the very chamber he had kept sealed, the place he associated with loss and absence. She had stripped bare not only her clothes, but the fortress he had built around himself. He could not forget the sight of her, the sound of her small laugh, the way she whispered, as if to no one, that it felt unreal. It had cracked something in him, something he thought was buried beyond reach. Adrian found excuses in the following week to cross paths with her again. He traced her through a gallery where student works hung, and there she was sketching alone in the corner. He did not speak at first, only watched her hand move over paper lines, forming shapes that carried an ache he recognized. When she finally looked up and saw him, her breath caught. She asked why he was there. He replied simply that he wanted to see if she was real. Their conversations were few at first. She resisted, wary, telling herself men like him belonged to another universe. But he persisted, not with force, but with quiet presence. He asked about her sketches. She admitted she drew people who never looked back at her faces in crowds who never noticed her. He told her he knew exactly how that felt. She laughed bitterly, saying he was the last person who could understand invisibility. Yet his eyes told a different story. Through each meeting, fragments of their backstories slipped into the air between them. She spoke of her mother's exhaustion of balancing shifts with classes of betrayal that had left her guarded. He spoke reluctantly at first of his fiancée, of the silence that had followed her absence, of the shower that had remained untouched until Elena's accidental arrival. He confessed that for years he had been surrounded by people but never truly seen. She confessed that for years she had been surrounded by people but never truly acknowledged. In their confessions, they recognized the mirror. It was not money or class that bound them, but wounds invisible to others. One evening, sitting across from each other at a quiet cafe, he told her that she had walked into his penthouse as a mistake, yet she might be the one thing in his life that felt intentional. She looked away, her cheeks burning, unsure whether to believe him. The world saw him as a billionaire, untouchable, ruthless. She saw him as a man who leaned a little too long against shadows, who flinched when loud noises echoed, who traced the rim of his glass as though keeping his hands from trembling, and he saw her not as a poor student, but as the girl who had dared to stand naked in his silence without even knowing it. Their worlds were not aligned yet in those exchanges. Those hesitant truths, they began to blur the distance. Elena still told herself it was impossible. Adrian still reminded himself he had no right. But every time their eyes met, the truth whispered louder than their denials. She had been invisible. He had been untouchable. And yet when they looked at each other, they both felt undeniably seen. Adrian began to appear in places Elena never expected, as though the city conspired to weave their paths together. One afternoon, she left her class clutching a roll of sketches, and there he was leaning against a sleek black car outside the institute. His presence drawing stares from passing students who whispered his name. He asked if she wanted coffee, his tone casual, though his eyes searched her face, as if the answer mattered more than the world. She hesitated, then nodded. In the cafe, he sat across from her tailored suit, contrasting with her simple jeans and ink-smudged fingers. Their conversation was halting, at first skimming the surface, but soon words spilled into deeper currents. He asked what she feared most. She said failure, the kind that makes every sacrifice worthless. She asked what haunted him. He said silence, the kind that follows when someone you love never comes back. Her chest tightened at the rawness in his voice. He watched her sketch while they talked, his gaze fixed not only on the lines she drew, but on the furrow of her brow, the way she bit her lip when shading shadows. She noticed how he listened, really listened, not as a man used to commanding rooms, but as someone starved of connection. Each encounter deepened the pull between them. In the hotel corridor one evening, the elevator shuddered to a halt between floors. The lights flickered, plunging them into brief darkness. Elna gripped the railing, breath sharp with panic. Without hesitation, Adrian stepped closer, his arm steady around her waist. He murmured that he had her, his voice low against her ear. She whispered she hated small spaces. He replied that he hated feeling helpless. For a moment their breaths mingled, the silence electric, their bodies close enough that the air seemed to thrum with unspoken possibility. When the lights returned and the elevator moved again, neither stepped back right away. Later in her studio corner, she showed him a half-finished sketch of the city skyline. He stood behind her watching the pencil glide across the page. She turned to find him closer, then she realized his eyes shadowed with something heavy. He said softly that she should not trust him, that men like him broke things they touched. She whispered back that maybe she was already broken. His jaw tightened, his hands curled, as if restraining himself from reaching for her. Another evening he invited her into his world, the high glass tower of his office, where the city stretched endless beneath them. He asked her to sit while he finished a call, and she did her presence quiet but grounding. When he hung up, he found her sketching him lines, capturing the curve of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. He asked why she drew him that way. She answered that it was how he carried weight no one else could see. He said nothing, only looked at her until she had to glance away. At a charity gala he invited her to attend, she felt painfully out of place in a borrowed dress. Yet when she entered the room, Adrian froze mid-conversation with investors. His gaze locked on her as though the glittering chandeliers and crowded guests dissolved. Later on the balcony, he found her leaning against the rail eyes lost in the blur of city lights. He draped his jacket around her shoulders without asking. She whispered she did not belong here. He said neither did he, but somehow she made it bearable. Their exchanges were laced with a rhythm that unsettled and soothed in equal measure. One moment his words sliced sharp, warning her to keep distance. The next they softened, drawing her closer. She felt suspended between danger and safety, between fear and desire. He seemed untouchable, a man of power, yet when he looked at her, she sensed fractures beneath the marble surface. He seemed drawn to her, a girl with nothing to offer but truth, as though it was the only currency he could still believe in. Each meeting left her more restless. At night she lay awake, remembering the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his nearness, the tension that coiled whenever they shared silence. She told herself it was foolish that she was invisible and he was unreachable. But when morning came, when his voice returned to her ears, when his eyes sought her in a crowd, the truth burned undeniable. There was a pull neither could sever. The city continued its endless rush outside, but within their stolen hours time bent around them. She carried sketchbooks filled with his silhouette. He carried meetings haunted by the memory of her laugh. And though neither dared name it, something fragile and dangerous was binding them tighter with each breath. The gala shimmered with chandeliers and whispered deals, every corner polished into perfection, every guest dressed like they belonged to a world Elena could never claim. She clutched the hem of her borrowed black satin dress, her hair tied back in a simple braid, and tried to ignore the stares of strangers who seemed to measure her with every glance. Adrian walked beside her, immaculate in a dark suit, his presence commanding enough that conversations paused as they passed. Yet when his hand brushed hers deliberately, fleeting her pulse scattered in her chest, he leaned down, his breath warm against her ear, and said she looked like she had stolen the night itself. She rolled her eyes, muttering that he was exaggerating, but the heat in his gaze told her otherwise. As the evening stretched, she excused herself to the powder room borrowed dress, rustling softly as she slipped into a quieter corridor. Inside, she faced the mirror, adjusting the neckline nervously, whispering that she was a fraud in borrowed silk. The door opened suddenly, and Adrian stepped in, his eyes darkening as he caught sight of her reflection. He froze for a beat, his gaze raking over her figure, not with crudeness, but with an intensity that made her knees weaken. She spun around, cheeks flushed, stammering that he should not be here. He stepped closer, his voice low, as he said he could not seem to stay away. The space between them vibrated with restraint, the mirror catching the tension of their silhouettes. He did not touch her, but the way his eyes lingered on the curve of her collarbone made her feel as though her skin was aflame. She slipped past him, whispering that people would notice. He let her go, but the hunger in his gaze followed her back into the glittering hall. Later that night on the balcony, the noise of the gala dulled into a muffled hum. She leaned against the rail, the city lights spread beneath them like fallen stars. The cold nipped at her bare shoulders until she felt the weight of fabric settle around her. Adrian had draped his jacket over her without a word. She turned to protest, but the look in his eyes silenced her. He stood close, his presence a wall of warmth against the chill. He murmured that she should not freeze for the sake of pretense. She whispered she did not fit in this world of polished smiles and hidden daggers. His lips curved faintly as he replied. Neither did he not anymore, but somehow she made it bearable. For a moment they stood in silence, the city humming below, the stars drowned by artificial light, and yet she felt as though she had never been seen so clearly. He reached as if to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers stopping just short. The restraint a more powerful touch than any contact. Her breath caught her body tense with anticipation. But he let his hand fall back, turning instead to face the skyline. She wanted to thank him for the jacket, for the unspoken comfort, but the words tangled in her throat. The night ended without a kiss, without scandal, but the air between them pulsed with something undeniable. In the days that followed, their intimacy grew not through physical touch, but through countless small moments that bound them more tightly than desire alone. She brought homemade pasta in a plastic container to his office one afternoon. He looked at it with surprise, then ate every bite murmuring that she was the first person who had fed him without expecting a deal in return. She smiled softly, telling him then he owed her nothing. He watched her sketch in his office while he worked her presence, grounding her quiet laugh, filling the sterile glass room with a warmth he had forgotten existed. Sometimes he looked up from a call to find her asleep, on the couch curled like she belonged there. He ended the call early, simply to watch her breathing. Once she caught him staring and asked why. He answered that she looked like the only honest thing in his world. Her cheeks burned, but she did not look away. Another evening she asked why he never let anyone touch his penthouse bed. His expression darkened shadows, flickering in his eyes. He said it had been empty for years, a shrine to silence. She asked why he let her near it. He replied because she looked like she needed it, more than he needed it untouched. She did not know what to say, only felt the truth seep deep into her bones. These were the moments that built their intimacy. Fragile threads woven from glances, from words, from quiet acts of care. They never kissed, never crossed the line, but their closeness was undeniable. She began to smile more, to doubt herself less. He began to breathe easier, to laugh softly, to let go of the fortress he had built around his heart. Their intimacy was not measured in touch, but in the way their silences fit together, in the way their eyes spoke when words failed. Yet beneath it all lay an undercurrent, a constant hum of tension, a promise of something inevitable, waiting just beyond restraint. And though neither dared speak, it both knew the distance between them was shrinking with every passing day. The quiet rhythm they had built could not last. It never does when a man like Adrian Kane is involved, a man whose every step is tracked by rivals, whose every silence is dissected by investors. The first fracture appeared in the form of a headline that spread across business columns one gray morning: billionaire. CEO spotted with mystery girl. The photograph showed Elena leaving the side entrance of Sterling Tower, her hair tousled sketchbook tucked against her chest. The image was grainy, but the insinuation was clear. Elena saw it on her phone as she walked into class, her stomach knotting so tightly she thought she would be sick. Whispers trailed her in the studio, curious glances, turning sharp as classmates exchanged smirks. By evening, the whispers had reached his boardroom. Investors demanded explanations. Adrian dismissed them with a glare, but the seeds of doubt had been sown. His enemies saw opportunity. One in particular, Victor Halden, a rival tech magnate, had been waiting for such a crack. Victor began feeding the press stories carefully chosen lies wrapped in half-truths. He called Elena a distraction, a nobody, and leaked to a tabloid that she was nothing more than a paid companion. Within days, headlines screamed call girl or girlfriend, and Elna's name was dragged through forums and gossip blogs. She sat in her small rented room reading comments that called her a gold digger, a fraud, a parasite. The scholarship committee at her institute requested a meeting to discuss concerns about her conduct, and her professors stopped calling on her in class. At the cafe where she worked part-time, customers whispered, asking if she was really the billionaire's plaything. Her cheeks burned with shame, her chest hollowing out with every stare. Adrian tried to shield her. He deployed his lawyers to silence some articles, but for every one pulled down, 2 more appeared. He told her to ignore them, but how could she when even buying groceries came with judgmental looks? She told him she was ruining him. He said calmly that she was the only thing in his life not already ruined. Yet the storm grew louder. One evening she left the institute to find Devin waiting outside. The boy who had once been her first love now smirked with bitter satisfaction. He held up his phone, showing messages he had sold to a gossip site, twisting old conversations into proof that she had always wanted a rich man to save her. She slapped the phone from his hand, but the damage was done. The next morning, an article appeared titled, "From Student to Social Climber," complete with quotes from Devin, painting her as desperate. Elena broke down in the privacy of her room, trembling with humiliation. Adrian found her hours later, her eyes red, her hands clenched. He sat beside her, his presence steady, and told her that none of it mattered. She whispered back that it mattered to everyone else. He lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes, and said the world had always wanted to watch him fall, and now they would use her to do it. She cried that she did not want to be his weakness. He replied that she was his strength, but even strength cannot silence a mob. At the next board meeting, shareholders openly questioned his judgment. Was he letting a girl with no pedigree compromise billion-dollar decisions? Victor smirked across the table, hinting at impropriety, fanning doubts like sparks into fire. Adrian sat unmoved, but his silence was its own kind of confession. Outside the glass tower, photographers stalked Elena's every step. One night as she left her cafe shift, a flash blinded her questions. Hurled about her relationship, about her supposed past. She pushed through heart-hammering until one man shouted a name she thought long buried. Her father's name. Her steps faltered. Somehow they had dug deep enough to unearth the man who had abandoned her, painting her as the daughter of a criminal who once skipped town with debts. She staggered home, shaking, unable to breathe. When Adrian arrived, she clutched the newspaper with trembling hands, begging him to let her go before his world destroyed her. He pulled the paper away and tore it to pieces, voice low and furious, as he swore he would not lose her. Yet that night, lying in his penthouse with the curtains drawn, she stared at the ceiling and felt a hollow truth. She did not belong in his world, and the world would never let her forget it. The more she tried to stay invisible, the more visible she became. In her classes the next day, no one sat beside her. Her professor handed back her portfolio without comment. Even the barista who once joked with her avoided her eyes. She felt like a ghost trapped in a spotlight she never asked for. Adrian's world pressed down harder. Contracts faltered. Partners hesitated. His phone buzzed with calls demanding clarity. He ignored most of them, choosing instead to sit with Elena, to ask about her drawings, to listen to her describe the lines of a skyline she longed to capture. Yet the tension gnawed at him. He could command markets, but he could not command the hearts of men poisoned by envy and fear. And Victor was not finished. He escalated from rumors to action-planting fake invoices that suggested Adrian's company funneled money to Elena through scholarships. A government inquiry was threatened, stocks dipped, the board called for an emergency session. For the first time, Adrian saw his empire tremble, and he knew the fault line was not a deal or a product, but a girl who had walked naked into his silence and made him feel alive again. Elena watched the chaos and felt crushing guilt. She told him she should disappear, that maybe the world would relent if she was gone. He told her flatly that the world could burn before he let her go. But inside fear curled at her spine. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe they could withstand it, but every headline, every whisper, every glare reminded her of the chasm between them. She had been invisible all her life, and now she was exposed under a microscope sharp enough to cut. Adrian swore he would protect her. She swore she did not need protecting. Yet both knew the storm had only begun, and the enemy watching from the shadows was ready to strike again. The storm that had begun with whispers soon grew teeth. Photographers no longer lingered politely at the edges of sidewalks. They shoved cameras in Elena's face as she walked to class, shouted questions designed to wound. She tried to ignore them, clutching her sketchbook like a shield. But each click of the shutter felt like a blade carving away her anonymity. One evening after leaving the cafe, she turned a corner and froze. A group of men blocked the narrow alley, not reporters this time, but strangers with intent heavy in their eyes. They taunted her with Victor Halden's name, demanding she deliver a message to Adrian that he back down from a lucrative acquisition or face consequences. Her pulse spiked, fear crawling icy through her veins. Before they could close in, Adrian appeared, his voice sharp and lethal, as he ordered them to leave her alone. His security team swarmed seconds later, but the damage was done. Elena's world had shifted from scandal to danger, her body trembling as Adrian pulled her close, his jaw clenched with fury. He told her he would never allow harm to touch her, but she could feel how fragile that promise was, how even his wealth and power could not build walls high enough. The next morning, he walked into a board meeting only to leave within minutes, abandoning a billion-dollar negotiation, when a message came that Elena had not arrived at class. He found her instead, sitting on the steps outside her building, shaken after spotting the same men trailing her. She begged him to stop, to let her go, to save himself. He shook his head, saying she was the only thing left worth saving. His rivals seized on his absence from the negotiation. Victor spread rumors that Adrian was compromised, his judgment clouded by a girl. The deal collapsed, stocks plummeted. His board erupted in chaos, voices rising, accusing him of recklessness. Adrian listened in silence, then stood and walked out the title of CEO, stripped from him in a single vote. Elena learned of it hours later, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the headlines. Adrian Kane ousted amid scandal. Her chest ached as though the breath had been torn from her. When he appeared at her door that night, no suit, no entourage, just a man who had lost everything but refused to surrender her, she broke down in tears. She whispered that she had ruined him. He lifted her face, his eyes steady, and told her he had chosen her over a throne of glass. For him it was no ruin. Still, she could not silence the guilt. Her scholarship was now under review. Her professors avoided her. Her classmates mocked her online. Even strangers spat the word gold digger when she walked past. She felt like a weight chained to him, dragging him deeper. He told her he could rebuild an empire, but could not rebuild her if she left. She clung to him that night, caught between desire and despair, feeling the fire of his presence and the inevitability of her departure. Gala's passed in a blur of tension. His enemies grew bolder, the press more vicious, and the city less forgiving. One afternoon, while walking home, she was cornered again, a flash of violence that ended only when Adrian's car screeched to a halt and he pulled her into safety. Her body shook in his arms, fear and shame colliding. He stroked her hair, murmuring that he was there, that she was safe. But in the silence that followed, she understood that his world would never allow her to remain untouched. That night she sat across from him in the penthouse, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls. He poured a drink, but did not sip it, his hands unsteady. She whispered that he had lost everything for her. He replied that what he had lost was replaceable, but what he had found in her was not. She shook her head, tears brimming, and said she could not bear to be the reason he fell. He reached for her, his fingers brushing her cheek, with a tenderness that unraveled her resolve. He said she was not the reason he fell, but the reason he chose to rise differently. She wanted to believe him, but the shadows of fear lingered. She lay beside him that night, listening to his heartbeat, memorizing its rhythm as though it would be the last time. In the morning she slipped away, leaving behind the sketch she had drawn of him standing in the shower doorway. That first night his eyes caught between shadow and light. On the corner she wrote a single line, "You saw me that night, don't unsee me." And with that, Elena Quinn disappeared into the city, leaving Adrian Kane to face the ruins of his empire and the hollow ache of her absence. Adrian woke to the silence of the penthouse and felt the absence like a wound. The sketch she had left lay on the nightstand, her handwriting etched into his mind. "You saw me that night. Don't unsee me." He carried the paper in his jacket as he faced the fallout of his choices. The board had voted him out, his name dragged through the mud, and yet none of it pierced as deeply as the emptiness where she had been. Reporters clamored for statements, rival CEOs mocked his downfall. Investors cut ties, but Adrian walked through the storm with the calm of a man who had already surrendered what mattered most. His empire had been built on dominance, but the empire could collapse, and he would not grieve. Losing her was different. He thought of her laugh under the shower's hiss, the way her eyes trembled, when she believed she was not enough, the courage it took for her to stay beside him while the world shredded her name. He thought of how she had slipped away, not out of cowardice, but out of love, because she believed sacrificing herself might save him. Yet she misunderstood. Without her, nothing was worth saving. He sat through meetings where lawyers outlined possible comeback strategies to reclaim the throne. He listened without interest. When asked if he regretted choosing her, he said simply, "No." They pressed for more, but he stood and left his silence the only answer. At night, he returned to the penthouse, once a monument to power, now a cavern of ghosts. He walked through rooms that smelled faintly of her presence. Her sketch left on the table, her laughter echoing in memory. He whispered to the empty air that he would have traded everything sooner if it had meant keeping her. Elna, meanwhile, found refuge with an aunt in a small coastal town. She enrolled quietly in community classes, worked shifts at a local diner, tried to vanish into anonymity. She told herself it was better this way, that Adrian could rebuild without her shadow clinging to him. Yet each night she lay awake, her chest hollow, her hands itching for a sketchbook. She drew his face over and over, the sharp cut of his jaw, the haunted light in his eyes. She remembered the way he told her she mattered, the way he held her, as though she was the only anchor left in his storm. She missed him with a ferocity that frightened her. Her aunt told her she looked thinner, quieter, that she carried sadness like a cloak. Elena smiled faintly and said she was fine, but inside she was unraveling. Back in the city, Adrian confronted Victor directly. He stormed into a boardroom where Victor lounged smugly with investors and told him that he could take the company, the headlines, the crown, but he would never take what mattered. Victor sneered, asking what that was. Adrian's eyes burned as he answered her. The room fell into silence. He turned and left, no longer fighting for an empire that no longer fed him. His sacrifice was complete. He had surrendered power, wealth, reputation, all willingly, and still it felt empty without her. Nights blurred into days, and he found himself walking streets without direction, his mind chasing memories of her voice. He stopped working, stopped caring, until one evening he entered his penthouse and knew he could not stay there another day. The place was a mausoleum, tied to the woman he had lost years ago, and now haunted by the woman he had lost again. He called his broker and told him to sell it. The broker stammered, reminding him of its worth, its symbolism. Adrian said it was worthless if it kept him bound to ghosts. The sacrifice of his home was the final thread cut. Elna heard of it weeks later through a headline. Billionaire sells iconic penthouse amid silence. Her heart clenched. She knew why he had done it. She sat on the porch of her aunt's house, staring at the sea tears sliding down her cheeks, as she whispered that he had given up everything. She clutched the necklace he had once slipped into her palm, a silver star. He said reminded him of the light he had thought extinguished. She held it against her chest and realized her sacrifice had not saved him. It had broken them both. She cried into the night, aching with the knowledge that love had demanded too much, and yet she still longed for him with every breath. Adrian stood in the empty gallery space he had purchased after selling the penthouse. White walls stretched wide, waiting. He envisioned her sketches lining them, her art finally given the place it deserved. He told himself this was his offering, his last attempt to prove that his sacrifice had meaning. He whispered her name into the vacant air, a vow echoing through silence. Elena. Weeks passed before Elena received the envelope. It arrived without return, address slipped beneath the door of her aunt's house. She turned it over in her hands, her breath uneven, and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single invitation, cream paper, embossed with letters that made her heart stutter. An art exhibition, her name printed boldly across the top as the featured artist. Confusion and disbelief flooded her as she whispered that it was impossible. She had never submitted her work, never sought recognition. Yet here was proof that someone had, and in her chest she already knew who. her aunt urged her to go to see for herself. The night of the event, she dressed simply, a white blouse and skirt, her hands shaking as she boarded the train back to the city she had fled. The gallery loomed with soft light spilling from tall windows, voices drifting out into the street. She hesitated at the door until a hostess smiled and said they had been expecting her. Elena stepped inside and froze. Her sketches lined the walls, each carefully framed, each illuminated as though it were treasure. Drawings she had hidden away, portraits of faces that never noticed her skylines scribbled late at night, and in the center a sketch of Adrian standing in shadow, the very one she had left behind. Her throat tightened. Around her guests murmured appreciation. Strangers studying her work with admiration she had never believed possible, and then she saw him. Adrian stood at the far end of the gallery, no longer in tailored armor, but in a simple shirt and dark trousers, his hair slightly disheveled. His eyes fixed solely on her. He did not move until she did, and when she finally took a step, he crossed the distance with steady strides. She whispered that he had done this, that he had sold the penthouse to build a place for her art. He nodded, his voice low but certain, saying he had given up the place that haunted him to create the place where she belonged. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she asked why. He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing the wetness away, and said because he loved her more than the empire, more than the silence, more than the life he had thought was all he deserved. She shook her head, whispering that he should not have sacrificed everything. His eyes held hers unwavering as he told her he had sacrificed nothing of value compared to what he had gained. Around them the crowd faded, the gallery dimmed, and all she could feel was his breath mingling with hers. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her body trembling as he wrapped his arms around her solid and unyielding. For the first time since she had left, she felt safe. He murmured against her hair that he had been waiting for her to come back, but when she did not, he came to find her in the only way he knew. She laughed through tears, saying he was impossible. He smiled faintly, saying perhaps, but she was his impossibility made real. The gallery echoed with the sound of applause from strangers admiring her work, but for her the only sound that mattered was the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. They stood there holding each other, no words needed. The grand gesture was not the gallery alone, nor the sacrifice of his wealth. It was the fact that he had chosen her again and again in the face of everything that told him not to. She lifted her gaze finally, their eyes locking, and whispered that she had missed him every day. He bent closer, his voice a vow, as he answered that he would never let her go again. The weeks that followed unfolded like a quiet miracle. Elena no longer walked with her head down through crowded streets. She lifted her chin, her eyes steady. Her sketches carried openly instead of hidden in a folder. Adrian walked beside her, not as a CEO cloaked in power, but as a man stripped of titles, his hand loosely intertwined with hers, his gaze softer than the city had ever seen. At the opening of her second exhibition, photographers crowded outside, flashes bursting against the night. But this time, when questions flew, Adrian did not hide. He reached for her hand in full view, lifted it gently, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. The world stilled. The gesture made headlines. The next morning, not as scandal, but as declaration. "Billionaire turns patron for love," they wrote. Though Adrian laughed at the word billionaire, telling her quietly he no longer cared to be defined by numbers. He cared only for the way she looked at him, when she was sketching for the way she laughed, when she burned toast for the way she curled against him at night, as though she had finally found home. Elena's art flourished. The gallery he had built became not only her sanctuary, but a beacon for others who had once felt invisible. Students came to study her work, critics praised her raw honesty, and for the first time she believed in her own worth. She no longer doubted if she belonged in his world, because together they had built a new one. Adrian adjusted easily, trading boardrooms for studio floors, phone calls for afternoons spent watching her work. Sometimes he still flinched at sudden noises still carried the shadows of a past he could never erase, but now he let her see them. And when she traced the lines of his hand, he felt the weight lift little by little. On the anniversary of the night she had stumbled into his penthouse, he returned with her to Stirling Tower. The hotel lobby looked the same, polished and cold, but the penthouse was no longer his. They rode the elevator up only to step into a space, transformed into her gallery walls, lined with her drawings, the air alive with color. She laughed softly, saying this was where it began. He stood behind her, his lips brushing her temple, and whispered no. This was where he began. That night they lay together with the city glowing beneath them, not in fear or secrecy, but in peace. He told her he did not need vows or signatures to define them, that surviving the storm had been their promise. She whispered that she still could not believe one mistake. One towel borrowed at midnight had led her here. He smiled against her skin and said sometimes the wrong door opens to the right life. Months turned into a year, and the frenzy of gossip faded. The empire he had lost was rebuilt in fragments not under his control but under new leadership. He did not return to claim it. He had found something richer. Elena's name grew in the art world, no longer tied to scandal, but to talent her shows, drawing crowds who spoke of her vision and her resilience. At each opening, Adrian stood quietly in the back, proud and content, his presence a steady anchor. They traveled sometimes not in private jets, but on trains and ferries, sketching and laughing, collecting moments instead of empires. On one quiet evening by the sea, she asked him if he ever missed the power he once wielded. He shook his head, watching the tide roll in, and said the only power worth keeping was the power to choose who you love. She leaned against him, her heart full, and knew she had finally found her place. Their story was no fairy tale. It was built from chaos, from mistakes, from wounds that left scars. Yet in the end, those very scars became proof of survival, of the courage to stay when the world tried to tear them apart. Elena Quinn, once invisible, now walked with certainty. Adrian Kane, once untouchable, now lived with vulnerability. Together they were not perfect, but real. And in the quiet of their nights, when she whispered that she loved him, he would answer not with grand speeches, but with the simple truth that she had given him life again. Some stories do not begin with fairy tales. They begin with a mistake, a towel at midnight, and the courage to choose love when everything else demands you let go.